Okay, good morning. I'm glad to see we had a nice turnout. Now, one thing I want to preface my presentation with is that this is brand new research for me. This is something I started last year. And so there might be some information you could provide me that you're much more familiar with the time period I'm looking at in the 60s and 70s than I would be as far as at this point of my research. Predominantly my research has been through the digital newspaper projects that are available for purchase, right, where you could go on. And it's also based somewhat on the stories I grew up hearing. I'm 47 years old, so I'd hear some of these stories from the 60s and 70s, particularly because my family was very politically active. My grandfather was in the American GI Forum. He was the state vice president for the American GI Forum in 1950, so he was the third ranking leader of the GI Forum under Edad, and then, of course, Hector P. Garcia. Interesting exchange one point where my grandfather was chastising Dr. Garcia when they had their state convention in Edinburgh. I won't get into that, but just to give you an idea, I come from a political family, in other words, and I might include a story here about Leo, my grandfather, having a little tiff. Not necessarily a disagreement where they disagree politically, but a tiff in the sense that Mr. Leo was concerned about a possible investigation to voter irregularities, and my grandfather was the senior investigator for the DA's office, and he basically said, calm down, don't worry about it. So, politics, right? Okay. So let's get into what I'm trying to do in relation to what the research is talking about, particularly the 60s and 70s, that I think we need to start having a reevaluation of how we understand political history of the 60s and 70s. Predominantly right now, when you look at Chicano history, it focuses on a Chicano movement paradigm. And what that means is that they focus on people who self-identified as Chicanos or who the scholar identifies as being part of the Chicano movement. So early on, that broke down to like the four sort of major leaders, as they saw it: Cesar Chavez, Corky Gonzalez, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, Reyes Lopez Tejerina, and Jose Ángel Gutierrez, right? We famously call them the Four Horsemen. And of course, there was pushback and critiques against this because that was a very male-centered understanding of the political history of the 60s and 70s. And then so they start expanding, including women, and as we go through the 70s and 80s, the scholarship develops and includes women, and starts including other organizations outside of those four, the smaller Chicano movement organizations, and they get into issues of sexuality, so on and so forth. But they still stay within that sort of, I think, lens of understanding the political history of the 60s and 70s. The American GI Forum didn't disappear. LULAC doesn't disappear. People who don't necessarily label themselves Chicanos, but nonetheless were important political actors of the 60s and 70s, existed, but they're not part of the record because they're not considered Chicanos. And I think what that does is it creates a distortion of the complex political history of the 60s and 70s. That we have to say, you know what, instead of focusing on who's a Chicano, who's not a Chicano, and whatever the agenda the Chicano movement organizations might have, let's just sit back and look at what is going on politically in the 60s and 70s. And forget about who's labeling themselves, other than you can identify, okay, this group is doing this and this group is doing this, and just do it that way, as opposed to being very sort of focused on who's in or out of the Chicano movement. Okay. And I think what happens is that then you get a much more complex, rich history of the political efforts of both Chicanos and non-Chicanos in the 60s and 70s. And so this is why I'm attempting this project, and I've just began this research. Now, post-World War II fundamentally changes politics in the United States. World War II is a watershed moment for the history of the United States for racial and gender relations. And one of the reasons that comes out is because obviously the nation needed to incorporate a large number of individuals to engage in that war effort, right? So now not only you can't engage in sort of the racial politics pre-World War II if you want to put together that military. Now there's still segregation, but as we get to the end of the military conflicts, blacks or African Americans are now allowed to be in combat roles as opposed to just supply roles by the end of the war. And then of course by you get to the end of the 40s and under Truman, he integrates the military. Women are now allowed to engage in occupations that they were forbidden before World War II because the men are gone and they need to fill those jobs. That's where we get the Rosie of the Rivers. So World War II is a fundamental moment of change in the United States. But in particular, I want to talk about the post-World War II moment, when this sort of change or dynamic is now going to start having these effects that I think people don't want or like. So first, we have to talk about the American GI Bill. The American GI Bill, it was a bill that offered financing for people to get homes or for education. Locally, what that's going to do is going to fundamentally change the demographics of Pan-American college. Prior to World War II, you did have Mexican Americans or Mexicanos attending Pan-American college. I mean, they're there from the 1927 when it begins. But they tended to come from the more elite families, the families that could afford to send their children to Pan-American college. Post-World War II, now you have these GIs, a lot of them, who have the financial ability to attend college for the first time. That many of their families couldn't do before, right? They're coming from farm working families, they're coming from laborers. Now they have the means to go to college, and they're going to take advantage of it. And so Pan-American college fundamentally changes, and it creates then this mobility from the working class Mexicanos that wasn't there before, right? The elite Mexicanos, you got to understand, the wealthiest people in the valley still are going to be the old Tejano or you know, the old settlers and their descendants, right? The bill, the American GI Reform doesn't improve their status. They're already part of the elite. But for the working class, it changes. And it also changes for working class whites that didn't have this ability either. So the GI Bill is very important to understand in the changing dynamics of politics post-World War II. You have then the Cold War, and the national government's now very concerned about race relations in the United States because they have this opponent, the Soviet Union, that they may engage in a future conflict. And so what the last thing they want to do is to have those continued racial divisions within the nation that could possibly weaken its efforts in a future conflict. And so the federal government will get actively involved, as we'll see with its pinnacle by the 1960s, of trying to fundamentally rearrange the racial politics of the United States, because it is part of our national security to be united and not divided, right? It's uneven, it's fragmented, but, you know, particularly the military is moving in this direction, which Truman initiated, but the military gets it. Because they're coming from a war where it didn't matter the skin of your color, your religion when you're in the foxhole. It's bullets flying at you and bullets you got sent back at them, and that's all that matters, right? And so the military has always been ahead when it comes to a lot of these racial issues. And so then we have a catalyst, this moment in 1948 with the Felix Longoria affair, where Felix Longoria was killed in the Pacific Theater. His body was to be returned to be buried at Three Rivers. The funeral home director refused to wake the body because it was a segregated funeral home. That led to a national outcry against the racism towards Mexican Americans, particularly the outcry that a service member who died defending his nation couldn't even get waked. And the American GI Forum happened to come together several months before that, the same year. And Dr. Hector P. Garcia was the force that helped put together the American GI Forum, and that became this catalyst to push the American GI Forum forward. So the American GI Forum becomes a very important political organization, by the 50s. It's not that LULAC's not around. LULAC is still around. But the American GI Forum is made up of veterans who can push back against the idea that they're communists when people criticize them for wanting to upend segregation in the United States. Because people like blacks, when they would say we want to end segregation, we're saying, oh, you just want to be a communist. You're a commie. You're a pinko, right? Well, Mexican Americans, because their organization was based on their patriotism, which actually LULAC was as well, but that's a different lecture. Just as a side note, Mexican American civil rights advocacy has always been based on military service. Mexicanos have been involved with the various conflicts for the Civil War on, and prior to the Civil War, the Spanish helped the English colonists win their liberty. It wasn't just the French; the Spanish were very important in that conflict as well. But nonetheless, the American GI Forum is this political force there. And so let's get, and the way I'm going to go through is I'm going to go through these specific elections that I found as possible turning points, and these specific elections that mark a change within shifting political leadership. It's going to be incomplete. There's probably some elections and people I missed. For instance, I grew up thinking Al Ramirez was the first Mexicano mayor of one of the new cities in the valley, and the new cities are cities along the railroad, of course, for the most part, you know, except for Edinburgh. But I just saw that the Mission had a mayor in 1958 to 1960. So I had to make a note here, say, whoa, you know, my tentative understanding of Al Ramirez being the first sort of guy who ushered in a Mexican American as a mayor of a city is incorrect. So, like, again, these are ongoing areas of research. But 1954, the Hidalgo County DA election, and I'm really going to be focusing on Hidalgo County, by the way. Joar Alamilla. The Alamilla family had a long history of being involved in politics. They're part of the Mexicano elite. Alamilla's ancestors were part of you had the Baker Alamilla machine. So everyone calls it the Baker machine, but Baker couldn't have been successful without the Alamillas involved in their efforts or political activities as well. Anyway, so Joar Alamilla is the district attorney. And his opponent is going to be Jim Bates. Now, Jim Bates, even though he's not Mexicano, is going to run a campaign based on supporting working class Mexicano needs. And the reason I know this is because my grandfather was his campaign manager, right? Jim Bates went to my grandfather because he knew my grandfather was very politically powerful within the Mexicano community. My grandfather, after World War II, went to Pan Am and got certified as a notary of the public. He was bilingual. He worked at, I forgot which lumber company, but many of the applicants who were using their GI money to build homes needed to buy the lumber. They couldn't process the paperwork, so my grandfather was hired to process. So my grandfather started meeting all these veterans through that process, and then he got his uncle, who was a World War I veteran, I think it was his uncle, got him politicized through J. Lou Sines, who was a founder of LULAC, and then he met Hector P., and that's how he got involved in the GI Forum. Because my grandfather said when he came back from the war, he didn't want to have any interactions, not even with other veterans, because of the combat he saw. He wanted to forget, he wanted to be with his family. But through his occupation, he ended up developing a network of political supporters. And so, so my grandfather was the campaign manager for Jim Bates. Later on in the 60s, he becomes Senator Jim Bates' special advisor or envoy. I forgot the name of the title. And Jim Bates defeats Alamilla. Jim Bates defeats Alamilla with a large chunk of the new working class voters who now were moving up through the fact that they got educated in the late 40s and early 50s through Pan Am because as a result of their GI Bill. So you got a new group of voters who are now making a little bit more money. They can pay the poll tax. So you dramatically change the voting dynamics of the county. And so Jim Bates wins that election. So I mark 54 as the beginning of this sort of working class Mexicano emergence against the old Mexican elite and against the old farmer elite. It doesn't mean they're going to disappear, as we're going to see with the election of Kika de la Garza, but there's this challenge now. It's the political system's being upended. In 1961, of course, we had Reynaldo Garza appointed as the first Mexican-American federal judge. That was through the efforts of the American GI Forum and the Viva Kennedy clubs. But that time in 61, this is going to be key, another organization is created, the Political Association of Spanish-Speaking Organizations, PASO for short. And PASO is important as I don't want to call it a precursor to the Chicano movement because it continues through the Chicano movement era. But as part of this sort of changing dynamic of the politics of the time, PASO is going to be much more radical than the American GI Forum in many ways. So even though Hector P. Garcia is the first president of PASO and all that, PASO becomes much more, for some people, particularly for Hector P., more radicalized. In fact, Hector P. Leaves PASO by 63 because he thinks they're too involved with the Teamsters and labor unions. So PASO's developed, and so PASO's going to create this structure for these World War II veterans who have some sort of education now, who are no longer just field workers, but they're working in sort of lower income, white collar jobs, and they could get into the politics and things that they weren't being able to do before. Change the dynamic, right? These aren't the ancestors of the landed elite. These are the descendants of the working class farmers. And then in 58-60, which I know nothing about other than I saw today, Adolfo de la Garza is mayor. What's interesting that I saw was that it was for 2 years from 58 to 60. I don't know why, because all the other terms were 4. So I don't know if he was a special election or he got appointed in 58 to 60. but it seems now he might be one of the first Mexicano mayors in this county in what we call a newcomer city. But the one I do know is Aldo Ramirez. Aldo Ramirez gets elected in 1963 to Edinburgh. And Ramirez is important because Ramirez will desegregate the swimming pool in Edinburgh before the Civil Rights Act. And in fact, PASO, many of the things we see in the Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voter Rights Act, PASO is advocating these, right? PASO is advocating great society programs. PASO is advocating the elimination of the poll tax. PASO is advocating desegregation, right? And so PASO is laying out these, what we would consider very liberal, radical programs. They don't see it as liberal, by the way. They just see it as a way of making society equal. But for conservatives, they're going to say, hey, you're upending the social order. And so Ramirez, without the push from the federal government, basically says this idea that blacks can only swim on Sundays because Monday we clean the pool and nobody swims on Mondays will no longer be practiced in Edinburgh. In retaliation for Ramirez getting elected mayor, by the way, he was an assistant superintendent at the Edinburgh School District. The school board passed a new regulations stating that no employee of the school district can ever run for political office. I don't know how constitutional is that, but they did pass it as sort of a way to prevent him. Well, now is Ramirez elected, Albert Peña Sr. Is also elected in the city commission, right? So you have this shift in Edinburgh. East Edinburgh comes out. East Edinburgh is the traditional Mexican side of Edinburgh, and they come out in great numbers, and they change the dynamics of the politics of the city. But simultaneously that you have this in Edinburgh, you have Crystal City and Los Cinco, where you have a complete sweep from Latino, Mexicano, take control of all the city offices in Crystal City. PASO was a key organizer for that effort, along with the Teamsters, right? So there's always this tension, like, what are the Teamsters doing? You know, are they taking over, not taking? But regardless, it's about political calculation, and the Teamsters are going to help you get elected. Like, I don't care, right? So they get elected and sweep into Crystal City. And while you have what's going on in Edinburgh, Crystal City is just making the shockwaves. I mean, the governor refused to accept the outcome of the election, and he sent a Texas Ranger down there to prevent the outcome of that election to be fulfilled. I mean, that's Governor Connolly. He's just saying, hey, I'm going to send Ranger Ali, and we're not going to let you take over, right? Eventually, he had to capitulate because, you know, we live in a democracy, for God's sake, and elections should count for something. But that's how traumatic the Crystal City election was. And Crystal City is going to inspire leadership in Weslaco. And I'm going to read you an analysis, a presentation by the PASO director of Hidalgo County in 1963, a gentleman you might know as Renato Cuellar from Weslaco. So I want to read some quotes because he's kind of predicting this change that's going to come to Weslaco, and it's in response to what happened in April in Crystal City, right? And Edinburgh just happened as well, the election. So I'm going to read you some select quotes here. Quote, "We want equal economic opportunity and a chance to be contributing members of the community. We think we have something to offer. They have had their own little tea party when we weren't represented. At this time, Place 4 in Weslaco was considered the Mexican slot. Even though it's an at-large city elections, the Place 4 was allocated for one Mexican-American representative. That's the way the politics played out. And Cuellar is going to get at this. Cuellar also points that whatever changes happen in Weslaco in the future politically will not be at the behest of PASO or the Teamsters Union, because, you know, again, people have this sort of bad taste with PASO or the Teamsters because they're seen too radical, right? But he does say, obviously, if they want to come in and help, we're not going to stop them. At this point, the demographics in Weslaco are 70% Latinos and 30% Anglos. However, the poll tax receipts is 52% Latino and 48% Anglo, right? And so what's not important is not the demographics of the city at this point because of the poll tax. What's important is who's paid the poll tax. And he points out that they're going to engage in an effort to increase the poll tax. So like in McAllen, that had the Gran Baile, which was a dance where you went and you paid your $1 to go dance, stuff like that. But when you paid that dollar, they took your information and it went to help pay your poll tax or paid your poll tax. And so they get the information for the person, they went and danced, they had a good time, and their poll tax was paid. And this continued, till through the elimination of the poll tax. So going on with Cuellar's quotes, a Crystal City would jar the people awake to the fact that we are not foreigners. We are treated like people who have been defeated in war. Our loyalty has been questioned, but we fought in 2 wars, of course referring to World War I and World War II. Again, this idea of somebody who's not white automatically is questioned as a foreigner, right? And that's the questions that have been raised about the birther issue with Donald Trump, that you have a white presidential candidate questioning whether somebody is a citizen or not who is not white, in this case Obama, right? And it's something that you wouldn't have a minority question a white person. You wouldn't have Obama questioning Donald Trump. Well, I want to see your papers. It's called the I want to see your papers sort of politics, right? Whereas automatically, if you're not white, you're automatically perceived as possibly foreign until you prove you're not. Right? And this is what Cuellar's talking about in '63. Even though we fought in wars, we've died, we bled, we're still seen as foreigners and not treated as equals, and this is a problem. In reference to the election in Crystal City again, the Crystal City losers are being childish about the whole thing. Connolly sent in his goon squad down there. A ranger is nothing but a goon to me. They should have tried to work with the winners. Latins would never treat Anglos as a secondary group. We would try to show them the error of their ways. Some of us are called wild-eyed liberals when we discuss these things, but we're not. All we want is equal opportunity. Again, the idea that we should be treated as equals, right? This is what part of the Chicano movement is. Just as a side note, if you've been following the news, there's this proposed Mexican American Heritage textbook in the state of Texas. And that's what that textbook gets at, the idea that, and what the textbook argues is that Mexican American culture or Mexican American heritage is a fundamental threat to the U.S. And it says it in the textbook. This is why we went to Austin and testified against it. And this is the writer talking about what he's seen from Cuellar in the meeting there. Many people see the transition coming. Cuellar said and wanted it to develop in an orderly fashion. 25 or 30 years ago, he continued, most Latins were not ready to hold public office, but military service knocked down the wall difference. And since then, more and more Latins have completed their education in colleges and universities. Again, going to the importance of the GI Bill, in particular for providing social mobility, which also leads to economic mobility and political mobility for working class Mexicanos. Again, distinct. This is a whole new group of people who are not part of the old Mexican elite, who are now vying for political power. So then we get to the '64 election for Congress. Congressman Kilgore decides not to run for re-election. This is going to pit Kika de la Garza and Lindsay Rodriguez. Lindsay Rodriguez is supported by PASO and the Teamsters or labor unions. Kika de la Garza is supported by the agricultural interests, is seen more conservative. Just to give you an idea of some of the headlines here, it was a very heated, divisive race. So Garza, the Rodriguez Congress scrape shapes as dilly. You probably should see it as a dilly. But just to give you a quote here from the newspaper article. De la Garza said Rodriguez couldn't speak Spanish. And in ethnic politics, right, that becomes important, right? It's kind of like Cruz and Rubio, where Cruz was like, oh, háblame en español, háblame en español, right? And Rodriguez retorted. Rodriguez came back with a statement that De la Garza couldn't speak English. So, it was a heated race. So what ends up happening is there's actually 3 candidates. There's a candidate from Harlingen who runs for the seat as well, ends up in a runoff. But Kika wins the race, as we all know. And looking at this, the question becomes, does this represent a re-entrenchment of the more conservative, old Mexicano elite, white elite politics, And possibly that's a yes, but I think you need to do a further assessment of what Kika actually did in Congress. I know with the Chicano movement, he's not always seen as a friend. The Chicano movement efforts, apparently he's concerned about some of the Chicano activists that are in college or active in the Valley at this time, and we'll get to MAYO in a minute. But I haven't done enough research on what Kike actually supported, didn't support as a legislator. I do know that he sees the Chicano movement as too radical, right? And obviously, if he sees PASO as too radical, what do you think he's going to see the Chicano movement activists as? But so anyway, he wins. It ends rather bitterly. Lindsay basically says that while he acknowledges his defeat, he thinks that the election was underhanded and that Kiko won in an underhanded way, and that he will continue to fight on for the next round with him and his supporters. But he got pretty soundly defeated, by the way. I mean, the difference in the votes was just tremendous, right? So that's the election of Kika in 64, and then we jump to the reformation of La Jolla in 65. And Leo J. Leo, and his son is here, Leo J. Leo, Hidalgo County PASO chairman, is going to be elected to the newly reconstituted La Jolla by 32 votes. Of course, La Jolla is a very small city, and the whole new city council of La Jolla is going to be of Mexican-American ancestry. So it's like a crystal city, but a crystal city like a phoenix, rising from the ashes from its previous existence as a city community back in the 20s to now it's created in 65. And the reason that's important, again, is that you're starting to see Mexicano representation not just be at a city commission level, that in many cities just say, okay, we're going to have at least one commissioner be Mexican-American so they could have some sort of say, but actually taking the main position, the leadership, the mayorship, right? And so Leo J. Leo is a part of that, and of course Leo J. Leo has a very long history of being involved in politics, both at the county, but also at the state and national level. But let's jump to an important event that happened here in the city of Mission, which is the MAYO conference, the Mexican American Youth Organization. The Mexican American Youth Organization started out at universities and colleges by college students, people who very much embrace the term as being Chicano. And they will meet here in 69 in Mission. The MAYO chapter at Pan Am will help organize the EdCouch-Elso walkouts, which receives national news. Walter Cronkite, broadcasts. I'll show the Walter Cronkite story clips about the walkout to my students. But one thing, I was asked on Tuesday by Davis Rankin of the comment that is this proposed textbook at the high school level that called the Chicano movement as anti-Western and wanted to destroy American society. And literally those are the words they used. Chicanos wanted to destroy American society. And of course, many of the speakers who presented talked about, like, I was a Chicano, I didn't want to destroy American society, I just want American society to live up to the principles of equality that we all believe in. But one thing I point out when I do teach this in my class is that it's very hard to claim that Chicanos wanted to destroy American society or were anti-government. Yes, some people, got the small group that's a separatist, but that happens everywhere, right? Chicanos are really, really going to get involved in pushing for increased access to Great Society programs, the war on poverty programs, right? And that is seen as too radical by some, right? They want to make sure poor kids are getting access to the programs. They want to make sure poor families are getting access to the programs. They want to make sure kids are getting into college, right? So the 60s and 70s becomes a very crucial point in education, particularly with the Chicano movement of increasing access to higher education, completing high school. And how do we tap into student financial aid? How do we tap into VISTA? How do we tap into the model cities? How do we tap into, well, PASO, by the way, has been arguing this since the early 60s. Now, what you have is you have Chicanos who are somewhat impatient, and they want to see it now, as most people when you're 20, 21, 19 want. And so the PASO guys who are now starting to filter into the political positions of mayor or city or in the county, right? Because one thing Squayat said, and I stated here in 63, is he goes, while the city of Westico is problematic, the county is not. Because he saw, and he ticked off Fidencio Guerra, and he ticked off some other political leaders there at the county level. So for Cuellar, who was the director of PASO for the county, he basically said, at the county level, we're not doing too bad. City of Westico, we got major problems here as far as representation. Okay, so, but when you get, so the PASO people, what the Chicanos are arguing for, the PASO people were arguing to create. So now they're created, and And the Chicano movement, young people are saying, it's not moving fast enough. We need those resources now. And so sometimes they would clash with the older liberals, I guess you could say, the World War II veteran liberals saying, you're moving too slow. Why aren't you getting stuff? And of course, until you're actually in political office and running a government, you understand that government moves slow. But when you're a college student and you haven't been in the position of having to run a bureaucracy, it is too slow. And so you're going to have these clashes. But the Chicano movement was never anti-Western, never anti-American. In fact, they wanted to access the federal programs the government was now making available to eliminate poverty. They wanted to then also engage in the idea of equality. Now, there's another aspect of the Chicano movement, a cultural aspect where there's a shift from emphasizing your Spanish roots to emphasizing your indigenous roots, and that's going on too, and that art. But when we're talking about just the politics, the bread and butter of politics, they're the same, but because of this bureaucratic system and being positioned, there's that tension. It's not fast enough. In fact, Chuy Ramirez gets arrested at the county. He's a high school student. I asked him, like, are you the Ramirez who got arrested up there, in '68 by the county judge? He goes, yeah. He goes, what happened? So we went to the county commissioner's court. Tony Orlandine was there. Tony Orlandine, a very famous labor activist. And MAYO people were there, and he was there. He was a high school senior, right? The priests were there. You got to understand, a lot of priests were involved in the Chicano movement, and they're advocating for these things. And the MAYO submitted a set of demands to the county judge and the commissioner's court saying, you guys aren't allocating the money in the appropriate way that it needs to get to the poor people of our county. Shame on you. And so the county judge, and I can't recall his name right now, asked, who wrote this letter? And Chuy said he looked around and he saw Tony Orlandine, and he goes, and there were all these older people, right? There's a lot of people who were much elderly. Was that the judge? And then Ernesto said, well, I did. And the judge said, Sheriff Castañeda, arrest him. He got arrested for submitting a letter criticizing how the county was distributing the new welfare programs. And I didn't know that because the article doesn't come out. The article just said this guy stood up, he got arrested, and then he tells me, I was 17, I was a senior in high school. Tony Orlandine wasn't saying anything, and of course the priests were there, and everybody's just quiet, and there was a lot of old people, and I figured, what do I got to lose? When you're 17, you got a lot of testosterone going on, right? Yeah, it was me. So he got arrested. But that's an example, I think, the tension I'm trying to get at between the PASO generation of activists who are seen as liberal and radical, who are arguing for the creation of these programs, and the Chicanos who are trying to say these programs aren't being implemented fast enough. But that sort of tension gets lost if you only focus on the Chicanos, and then everybody who's non-Chicano is seen as somehow an opponent or evil or too conservative, right? I think when you're running government, things are slow, and if it's not fast enough for some people, now you get labeled as too conservative, right? And it's just the mechanics of government. So then by '69 we have the conference in Mission at the end of December. Over 600 people show up from around the state at the MAYO conference, and we have one of the attendees here for the first day, Mr. Chapa. And they discuss, what are the goals of MAYO and how we're going to organize politically. And the reason this meeting is so important is because in part 3, particular ideas or agenda items get developed. One is a political party, which is by 1970 becomes La Raza Unida political party, which continues then to take over Crystal City and put its agenda forward. You gotta remember, La Raza Unida was most radical because they actually took advantage of free lunch for their schools. I mean, today we don't think that's a radical thing, but many of the conservatives in Crystal City, why are we taking the free lunch for the kids? That's that liberal baloney. Yeah. But is that really anti-American? Is that really radical? Or is that just saying the government's offering programs to feed kids who are poor, our kids are poor, let's take advantage of it, right? But it was just seen as being too radical, too un-American. The second thing was the creation of a college or higher education, Chicano higher ed institution, which became Jacinto Trevino College. And then the third thing was around art. We need to have some sort of place to house our art, whatever. And Mission, which the building still stands today, Xochitl Art Institute, or art what's the exact title of it? Xochitl art something center, art cultural center, or something like that.
Estudios Rio.
Huh?
Estudios Rio.
But then it shifted to Xochitl, right? So Studios Rio before that, and it shifts. Now the gallery was there before, but it shifts, and that place, this building, had artists who are very prominent today, right? Carmen Lomas Garza. So if you ever see portraits of Mexicano families like eating raspa on the porch or the piñata, or if you saw the movie Selena, where the scene is she's on top of the house, those are based on Carmen Lomas's images, right? And the artists who exhibited here were called Los Quemados, and the reason they're called Los Quemados is because the images they wanted to portray in the art wasn't the radical power fist in your sky and the farm worker stuff. It was just regular scenes of life for families, right? And they thought the radicalness of their art was to show the rest of the world that Mexican American families are just like you, except that we eat raspas and tamales and stuff like that, but we're just like you, we love our families. And so the MAYO convention puts these ideas out there, and they eventually, within a year or two, are successful. So that's MAYO. MAYO's doing that, right? And again, this impatience for MAYO. Well, besides Crystal City in 70 and 71 winning those elections, you have the mayor of Wesco, Pablo Peña, becomes the first Mexican-American mayor of Wesco in 71. Guayar was talking about this in 63, right? That sort of takeover. Mr. Peña just died this week, by the way. And that's one of the things that concerns me, is that we have many of these sort of seminal political leaders at the city levels, and we don't have their histories and we don't know who they are. And we're not teaching that, right? I'm probably the only one teaching this sort of history right now in the country. And I'm teaching it to particularly my dual enrollment Mexican American students, but my Mexican American history class in particular. And so Mr. Peña, took power in 71, and I believe pretty much the whole city commission at that point becomes Mexican American, 71. You have also Lalo Arcate in San Juan in 71 becoming mayor. I don't know the complete composition of San Juan, but I believe they made a complete switch to Mexican Americans in 71. So you're having that Crystal City moment in 63, then the Crystal City moment again in 1970, and you have these other cities in the valley kind of follow through. These individuals probably didn't call themselves Chicanos, but they certainly aligned with many of the ideas of the Chicano movement when it came to access to economic opportunity, when it came to access of equality within society in general. They just may have not got into the whole idea of the indigenous art and stuff like that. And it's going to vary from member to member. By 1976, you have the election of Sheriff Marmolejo over Castañeda. Castañeda is kind of the sort of last holdout of that sort of rancher elite, white elite. Sheriff Marmolejo was very, very much a sheriff who actually would take the calls of farm worker mothers. So a farm worker mother would call and say, hey, my son or my brother or my husband is in jail, got in trouble for this. And he goes, let me find out what the charge is. If it's not that bad, I will personally release them. Because the family couldn't bond. They couldn't afford to bond. But they also couldn't afford to have their husband or brother or whoever not working either. And so Marmolejo would find out what the charge is. If it wasn't a serious charge, then he would personally release them. And the sheriff can do that in Texas. And he did that constantly. Nobody else was doing this for working class Mexicanos. If you're part of the political elite, or you had the money to hire an expensive lawyer, then the judge would do it. But Marmolejo was doing this for working class. Now, of course, the end of his political career is problematic because of the issue with the bribes and all that. But when he first came to office, he ran on a very sort of working class coalition of voters to win. Now, it also helped that Castañeda's daughter and son-in-law, the week of the election, got busted for moving weed. So that kind of solidified Marmolejo's takeover, right? But at the same time that Marmolejo was elected in 76, Irma Rangel is elected. And Irma Rangel is the first Mexican-American woman to be in the State House of Representatives in Texas. So by the 70s, you start to see the shift, right? Again, I don't think anybody who's a scholar refers to Irma Rangel or Marmolejo or Peña or Cuellar or any of these individuals as Chicanos. They get lost in the story if you're only looking to see who were the Chicanos and what did they do. I'm trying to shift that question is who was doing what in the 60s and 70s as opposed to who belonged to this particular group. and then try to understand the internal political tensions between, say, Chicano movement activists and really what we're seeing is the PASO activists, who are older, tend to be World War II veterans, tend to have some sort of education, directly moved up from working class. Chicanos did too. But Chicanos are that sort of next generation that is going through what the American GI Bill offered, except with the Chicanos, post-66 in particular, they're using federal student aid and grants and these new things that allows them to enter college in greater numbers. And then I'm going to end it with this sort of shift with the Miguel Navarez, who became president of Pan American University, and I want to make sure I get the year right, I believe it's 81, in 1981. And Pan American University and Navarez is going to shift the focus, right? Because the 60s and 70s is about, we need to increase access. We need to get more students enrolled. We need to get more students enrolled. With Navarez, he begins to shift the conversation, not just necessarily do we need to get more students into higher education. We need to make sure they graduate. So the shift of the conversation went from access to graduation, which if you read the Plan de Santa Barbara that came out of California in '68, basically said the same thing. Now, I don't think Navarez, trust me, I used to be a reporter at the Pan American, so I had interactions with Navarez. I don't think Navarez has ever considered himself really like the hardcore Chicano. Maybe he at one point called himself Chicano, I'm not sure. But basically Navarez in 81 begins the process, whether he acknowledges the Plan of Santa Barbara or not, of implementing the idea of completion for higher education. It's not good enough that we just get in there and our numbers are good of coming in, but that we finish. And so you see then that political shift from World War II to the 80s of a emergence of a working class political community, upending the political order that upsets the elites sometimes. Both Mexicano elites and white elites that are tied together. In the Valley, there's never been a complete just whites and Mexicanos. In some cities there were like that, but when you get to the county levels and large county areas, it gets hard to do that, just because of the political power, Mexicano elites, and their financial resources that they have. It's just that instead of being Mexicano, sometimes they become Spanish, because Mexican is a pejorative term for some people. You know, Rodolfo Acuña has a book, Anything But Mexican, you know, because people are ashamed to call themselves Mexican. It's just like when you see people say, I'm American, instead of supposed to Mexican American, whatever. Yes?
I have a question since you're talking about like wages or whatever. The term Chicano, and I've been asked this several times, and I've heard this question out several times. The term Chicano, as far as the movement is concerned, how did that term derive?
I asked the gentleman to your left because he lived it. I don't know who was the first person to call himself a Chicano in the sense of the 60s. I mean, the term has an older genealogy to it, but I don't know who the first person that says we're Chicanos. Would it be Alurista or?
California. California. El Alurista was from California.
Yeah.
And then I think those of us that were pressed for an answer to that question, we reverted to the fact that the Mexicas, and this was part of it when it shifted to the indigenous groups, and that the pronunciation of the Aztecs they were the Mexicas, and so they were Mexicanos. And then simply, it prefs further, if they still weren't buying that, a lot of us in the Chicano movement just said, well, look, that's a term that we adopted, and what we can say is it was not imposed on us by some government agency or some other group of people, but those of us that choose to call ourselves Chicano, we chose that term. But a lot of us wanted to kind of go back to our indigenous roots by tying it to Mexicano. That's one of the reasons.
Yeah, you might get a lot better answers for some of your questions from the audience than from me. So and that's why this is one of the reasons I accepted I'm kind of reducing my presentations because I need to start working on my book because I've been caught up with too much of my activism.
The brown beret, you didn't mention that.
No, I didn't, because I'm really trying to focus on the non-Chicano movement organizations. But the Brown Berets, I do not have a good enough grasp. I know they're here, they're active.
They were active back then.
and there's chapters here in San Antonio. David Montajano has a book on the Brown Berets.
No, but not that. I mean, I was in MAYO and Rasunida. The Brown Berets were separate, and then they ended up taking over Colegio Jacinto Trevino.
Right.
And then one of their original founders in the valley, because the Brown Berets came out of California. One of their original founders is still, you can see him there on 17th Street in McAllen, who ended up being a big backer of Olson Brand.
Right.
So,
Who's that?
Pablo Delgado and Padillo, we call him. And, so, but yeah, the Brown Berets during a lot of the protest movement and stuff like that were involved. And
Yeah.
we did have a very local, and some of those then moved on to into the farm worker movement.
Any other question? Go ahead.
Dana, if I could, I mean, I don't know if you finished, but since Leo Jr. and Jimmy are here from Mr. Leo's family, Mr. Leo showed me a letter that he wrote to Dr. Garcia, and I was really surprised because he was telling Dr. Garcia, oh, this is what Mr. Leo was, he may have been hitting PASO, but he was basically calling Dr. Garcia a sellout.
Yeah.
And they had an argument, and then I talked to some other members, and it had to do with a state Democratic convention that took place, and the PASO people were really pushing, for more representation, to have a delegation seated, and maybe even get some representation to the National Democratic Convention, and the GI Forum was pushing for getting the first state highway patrol, Mexican-American highway patrolman selected. And I forget who the governor was at the time, but he basically started negotiating with GI Forum and maybe some other Mexican-American Democrats, and they came up with, he was gonna give them 2. And so the PASO people felt that they wanted so much more that how could you just accept to have 1 or 2 motor and it was motorcycle highway patrol.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the PASO
sort of the but I remember I remember Mr. Leo telling
From what- Hector.
he starts off by saying that he had a lot of respect
Yeah,
for all
yeah.
that, but how could you
Settle for that,
how
yeah.
could you settle for so little?
Yeah, the PASO leaders that come out 61, particularly in the valley, Ignacio Garcia calls them the more radical element of the American GI Forum branch because they were impatient with the part of the slow change of what was going on. And the thing is, particularly when you're talking about veterans, it's very hard to scare veterans, combat veterans I'm talking about. They're not going to get intimidated, right? So everybody is a combat veteran in these groups for the most part. And when you have differences of political tactics, you're not going to be scared to, oh, this is Dr. Hector P. Garcia. I mean, we venerate Dr. Hector P. Garcia because this is time. But when you're living the moment in the 50s and 60s, and you very much respect Dr. Hector P. Garcia because he's this very important national leader, it didn't mean you weren't going to engage in disagreeing with them for these political. Like I said, I found this letter where in 53, my grandfather was upset with Hector P. because he thought he was being disrespectful towards the members who want to support George I. Sanchez. George I. Sanchez had a critique of the American GI Forum. They were having the convention in Edinburgh that my grandfather hosted, and Hector and Eddie Dodd from Laredo maneuvered the meeting to silence Sanchez. And some of the members there who didn't agree with Sanchez, but still thought nonetheless he should be respected because he was the older statesman. Because Hector is a newcomer, new guy, whippersnapper, you think of it. And they thought that that Hector was being disrespectful of their elders, right? And in our community, in our culture, you pay that. You may disagree, but you still have that respect. And again, it kind of plays out. I guess when you get to the Chicano movement, right? This sort of tension between I want stuff immediate now, I want this stuff, and then you get older, or you get involved in the machinery of bureaucracies, and and you kind of start lowering your scope of what you think can get done efficiently, and more importantly, what can you get done, and what you try to push for the big pie, but you're only going to get half the pie. You might decide, let's go for half the pie at least, as opposed to growing the big pie and getting nothing, right? But if you're outside the mechanics of power, you're a sellout. You know, well, he sold out. You only, where Hector says he only took 2, right? But he might have realized politically that's all they could accomplish, or it'd be nothing. But again, those are, you know, that happens today. Yes, ma'am.
I just find it interesting that at a time when Donald Trump may possibly be the next president is when a lot of us are coming out and sharing our stories. I've spoken to Lisa and to Vernon about some of the things that happened to me. And I was at the meeting in San Juan, the healthcare district, where Father Jerry Frank and a veteran stood up. And I mean, they went like this.
Mhm.
And the veteran stood his ground. I was so scared. Either one could have had a stroke. And so upset. The veteran walked out behind him, not necessarily in support of him, but just the fact that I came home, and my husband can tell you, I was so afraid, you know, chairs, punches would be thrown, and I walked out. But I had to respect the veteran. I had to respect him. And the priest said, thank you for serving the country, but you have no voice in this meeting. Well, it was on the internet. The meetings were announced on the internet. Once you're on the internet, anybody, even Obama, could show up and ask a question about healthcare, but they weren't like this. So me, I respect the veterans. My father was a WW2, his father, and all these people, you know, like Lisa, that are bringing forth speakers like you. And I don't know, that's me.
Yeah, but that's the nature of politics, right? You get into those tensions. In this case, it's over the issue of the district, the taxing district. And as historians, we have to understand contextualizing the events and the complexity of what they happen. One of the things I try to teach my students is that people are going to have various views. That's the nature of human society. And they had various views in the past, and they have various views today. That's just the way things work. And we got to be mindful as historians to try to tease out all those views and perspectives. And this is where empathy, as part of our training as historians, is very important. You don't have to agree with people's views in the past, but you have to tease out how they're being developed and why they're being expressed. When you start saying, well, that's the way everybody thought the same way, well, then you're really not engaging in history. You're just making some sort of flat statement. Any other questions? And the reason, again, I agreed to this because I was hoping people would come in that actually know more than me. Because, like I said, I'm very at the beginning of this. I'm mainly an early 20th century historian. I go up to the 1929, 1930s, actually, from the late 19th century. So that early part of the formation of the valley, when the railroad comes in and the changes there. But I would like to emphasize, and since we're talking about veterans, the history of Mexican American civil rights organizing has historically always come from the idea of military service and patriotism. The LULAC founders, the majority of them were World War I veterans. And then, in fact, Hector P. Garcia was a LULAC member before he founded the American GI Forum. But then he founded the American GI Forum based on that. But that's how LULAC was formed as well. But the leadership in LULAC saw that there was this opportunity for this generation of World War II veterans to really come together around that event and create a political organization that way. Yes?
Can you tell us what your book is going to be about?
Well, I got to start writing. I got to stop going and testifying and advocating and stuff. It takes a lot of time and effort. It's going to be an intellectual history. It is looking at, and I've broadened it, tentatively calling it the West Strip, the cradle of Mexican American civil rights. And what I do is I trace the political idea. It's an intellectual history, really. I trace the political ideas that are expressed in the early 19th century from the community here. Because for those who don't know, this community is obviously older than the United States itself as an entity. And looking at the Gutierrez Lara brothers, and in particular Antonio, who wrote political manifestos that express the ideas of liberalism and democracy and capitalism, right? You understand, this settlement, Nueva Santa Ed, is the most successful Spanish colonial settlement in the northern part of the colonies, right? So Spain's northern colonies were from Florida all the way to California, right? And Louisiana was controlled by Spain. And these colonies and these areas were really made for defensive purposes, for strategic purposes, not necessarily to make money, simply because the real wealth of the Spanish Empire was in Mexico, right? The mines and stuff like that. And so it was really hard to get people to go north. It was like, why are you going to go north? all the wealth is here, right? But this area, the economics of the world was changing. The economics of the Spanish Empire was changing to ranching as being one of the conduits of how Spain was making its wealth. And so the people who settled here in the 1740s and going into the 1750s were ranchers. They're vaqueros. And people fail to understand many times that means you're a business person. Your business operation was your ranch. And so the Spanish government said, you got 10 years of tax-free duties, you're going to get some properties when you get here, and you can bring in your cattle and your livestock. And they did that. But they didn't have any support from the military, and they don't have any. This is why we don't have missions here. This is why we're different from San Antonio or New Mexico or where they have missions. We don't have missions because the settlers were tasked with being soldiers and converting the natives or killing them if they didn't convert. But one way or another, pacifying the native groups here because they were causing problems for Mexican mines. So anyway, that experience develops these ideas of liberalism and capitalism, going back to the 1740s, right? Predates the U.S. Revolution. And they're expressing this because the Spanish are very much support education. So the first free public school is in Matamoros in the 1790s, right? So education, reading, writing, ideas that we should be able to seek economic opportunity. Like what Cuellar says, and that's how I grew up. It says, I don't want a handout, I want an opportunity to get ahead. So that's a very Mexicano thing from this part of the world. This is why we're sometimes seen as conservative, is it was like, we want these economic opportunities, which sometimes then clash with the Great Society programs that some people are saying we should use and say, well, you know, that's not what we are as Mexicanos, we shouldn't get the free lunch. But nonetheless, the origins of those ideas start in the early 19th century with the Spanish War of Independence. So I'm tracing those ideas through then the incorporation of this area within the United States with the war in Mexico, the U.S.-Mexican War, and Cortina's manifestos. And Cortina's basically saying, look, we would accept it incorporation in the U.S. if you treated us as equals, but you're trying to steal our land. And this is not democracy, and you guys are supposed to be at the forefront of democracy, right? And so post 1848, the expressions are still liberal and stuff like that, but the expressions start to point to the idea that Americans are not living up to the ideals they say they are expressing. Right. And that's going to continue through the 19th century into the early 20th century. Now, part of all this is going on as well is because the settlers have to come in and pacify the native groups. Part of your growing up as a child in the area of the valley, what becomes the valley here, is you have to learn military tactics as a kid. Even the women had to learn it, right? So you had to learn how to track Indians and kill them. You had to learn to track people and steal their children or repel Indian attacks. So part of this liberal capitalistic ideals is also a martial culture. So when we talk about the continued enlistments of Mexicanos within the military from this area, it's not simply an economic reason that, oh, this is a way for poor Mexicanos to get jobs. We have a traditionally long history of a martial culture. The idea that, okay, if I got to shoot you, I'll shoot you. You know, we have a lot of guns in the valley, and we all grew up hunting. But prior to growing up hunting and all that, we also grew up with these ideas that you got to physically defend yourself. Right, and so those ideas have continued to trickle their ways down into the military service, and then, you know, I come from a military family, right? So you have families who have members who served in the military and served in conflict, and so you're surrounded by these ideas of military service as just being a natural part of my family, my community. So, but that has a long history to it. So the idea of military service, regardless was in the Spanish Empire, tied to the ideas of equality and entrepreneurship. Continue to work their way up until you see it really expressed in LULAC. But what LULAC does is changes the conversation to the idea, well, we are citizens now, and you have to treat us as citizens. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the synopsis of the book.
And when will that be coming out?
I don't know. I got to start writing it. So that's why, other than this presentation, I've turned down a lot of presentation offers, but I thought this would be an opportunity to work on some new topics, right?
Thank you so much.
So, yes.
Well, I met with Lisa 2 weeks ago in Vernon over there. There is a book that we may have even gotten at a garage sale. Juan Cortina, there was a gentleman named Carvajal.
Yeah, Jose Carvajal. Yeah, he's part of the work I do.
All we hear is Cortina.
Well, Carvajal predates Cortina.
Right.
Carvajal.
You know,
Yeah, no, Carvajal is very important. I mean, Cortina is important because it's post U.S. incorporation. Carvajal is there before and after, right? And in particular, we have Mexicano participation in this area in the Civil War, either as a Union or Confederate forces, but you have a lot of Mexicano participation in the war against the French in Mexico, right? So one of the reasons we celebrate the Cinco de Mayo so much in the Valley is because our ancestors fought in that battle. What happened is that General Zaragoza from Matamoros was in charge of the military forces in Puebla, and he took a lot of the soldiers or the people from this area to fight in the war against the French. And I guess, again, they come from that generation of fighting Indians and stuff like that. And they're mainly cavalry, and they serve under Porfirio Diaz as a junior officer at that point. And so the celebrations of Cinco de Mayo that occur here occur because the early celebrations were the veterans celebrating their participation in that battle. A lot of people have forgotten about that. Now we just celebrate just to celebrate as sort of ethnic pride. But for the Valley, it's because we have direct lines to participants of that battle against the French. And so you'll have people fighting against the French, but also fighting in the U.S. Civil War. And the major turning point against the French happens outside of Roma on the Mexican side, the Battle of Conejos. What's the city?
Rancho Santa Gertrudis.
Yeah, Rancho Santa Gertrudis, where the French supply lines are destroyed by Cortina and Carvajal and others. So, I mean, Cortina, Carvajal, I think, might have been too old to fight, but he might have been involved.
One of the heroes of Cinco de Mayo, Mariano Escobedo, was
From
in
this
this area
yeah.
and in Santa Gertrudis, and even at a time got arrested in Rio Grande City.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, to give you an idea, the Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara, who's from Guerrero Viejo, now his brother Antonio, the guy who writes the manifestos, but Bernardo went from Guerrero Viejo all the way to Washington, D.C. to seek arms and support for the Mexican War of Independence. Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara and Tejanos will fight at the Battle of New Orleans. You know, so I mean, you can trace Spanish and then Mexican participation within U.S. wars of conflict going to the American Revolution. I mean, so it's not just like post-Civil War, it's even pre-Civil War that you have Mexicans involved in supporting them. In this case, the war against the British, yes.
You were talking earlier about PASO and MAYO
Uh-huh.
and the like. I know that in 1972, La Raza Unida Party gathered a lot of votes.
Mhm.
It was very, very strong. And yet, maybe 2-4 years later, it was just
It broke apart.
Yeah, it broke apart. What was the main reason for that?
I think personalities. I know that Jose Angel is very upset when he got kicked out as county judge, but he didn't get kicked out as county judge by another white person. He got kicked out by other Mexicanos. And I think it had to do with Jose Angel Gutierrez, as opposed to some sort of outside issue, right? So what you have is you have these parties and you have personalities within these parties and they fight with each other. And if there's not a long, sustained stability of the party structure itself, and the party's built on personalities, which happens with the early formation of parties, they will break apart, right? If the party is not stuck to an individual, it can sustain itself despite those internal divisions. And I think La Raza Unida, like many parties that try to emerge in the United States, will go through those sorts of, they'll have this sort of fluorescence and they'll be real powerful, and then something happens and they break apart.
Was that the year that Ramsey was in?
Ramsey was 76? What was your,
72?
was it 72? Was it 72?
And that hastened the demise of the party. Obviously, the publicity generated out of that. I know we tried to keep it together after the first election, and then I remember one of our state senators went on the air saying that when that election was lost, that Raza Unida was over, and then some of us got some airtime and told him that we were going to go on, but then the incident happened after. Well, this was after the second election.
Yeah.
And but that did hasten and there were already, you know, feuds that had started, and because Raza Unida came together in El Paso when the four horsemen came together, but then they all had their different visions, you know, for what Raza Unida
Should be.
should be.
Yeah.
yeah, and then Jose Angel's problems in Crystal City when his own Razonida people,
Ejected him,
pushed out,
yeah. Was it, I mean, Razonida was successful in LA for a couple of city commission slots too. I mean, so it gives you the reach of the party outside of Texas, and also in Wisconsin and the Midwest, there's Razonida party affiliates that were at the small scale victorious. So we tend to focus on Texas, stuff like that, and Texas is the focal point, obviously. But you had people who represent the Razonida party outside of Texas, and they had their victories as well. But the party could not sustain itself, right? It's hard to sustain political parties. You need money, you need some sort of unified platform, and you need the leadership, despite their differences, to sustain the party. And I think in this case that wasn't the case. But that is typical as opposed to atypical. A party that actually sustains itself is atypical. They're just hard. Yes.
Going back to this, the amount I've been reading about this history book they want to put out at the schools. Who is the one that makes the decision? I don't understand.
The process?
The process of
Okay.
getting that book that was written by Dunbar.
Cynthia Dunbar.
Dunbar.
Yeah. Actually, Christopher Carmona, my colleague at UTRGV, and myself, we both testified at the hearing on Tuesday. So the way it works in Texas is that the State Board of Education will put out a call for a textbook. And in this case, they gave like 2 years. They said, we want a textbook on, in this case, Mexican American Studies. And then as long as you are incorporated and you're licensed, you can submit a textbook. You don't have to be an expert on the subject, right? So I got a PhD in history. I could submit a textbook in science. And the state of Texas has to consider it. And so what we're at their process of the consideration of this textbook. And so the way it works is the publisher puts out an early copy, which it did in May. The public is allowed to read that copy, comment, and also point factual errors, and they get submitted to the publisher, and there's a system that they have on the website to do that. And then they have a hearing, right? And so this hearing that happened this week was the first hearing to hear about the textbook. And there's over 100 people signed up, obviously against the textbook, and they expressed their concerns. Christopher Carmona, myself, and 6 other scholars evaluate the textbook at the behest of Ruben Cortez, who's on the State Board of Education. I think that's the first time that ever happened. And we were able to have our testimony and exchange with the board members. Now, the board members are 15 members. At this point, they're just taking in testimony. October 21st, the publisher is going to turn in their responses or changes to the concerns that were submitted to them. And then the board will determine to accept or reject in November. So right now, we're at the process where the publisher and the authors are having to address the noted errors and concerns that people have made about the textbook. Apparently, they've already made some changes. Like, they're still trying to keep the lazy Mexican stuff in there, but they're trying to contextualize it somehow different from what I've seen. I haven't had a chance to really look at it. I'm kind of exhausted and burnt out. I'm going to wait for like a week or two before I start looking at the changes. But I still think they got us as drunk and lazy in there, and the Chicano movement as, essentially terrorists against the U.S. We'll see. But this is an ongoing process. I know that it's probably going to be rejected because many of the Republicans don't like the textbook either, at least the way they express themselves. So at least 8 people on the board have publicly stated they will reject the textbook. But you never know until the vote happens.
Does everyone always go through this?
Everybody in the state of Texas for any textbook goes through that process. Now, since I'm on the American Historical Associations, we have concerns about that process. And it's not just Texas. California does this. All the states do it this way. Concerns about this process because what you have is essentially the ability of non-experts to try to write a textbook on an expertise that is, that they don't know, because they got a political agenda, not because they're the scholarly experts on that topic. So right now there's a fight on evolution, right? There's an effort to try to eliminate evolution as part of the biology textbooks, right? So that's a separate fight. I'm not involved in that fight, but that's a separate fight with because the people pushing that forward are not scientists, but they have this political view that evolution is incorrect, and they don't want it taught in the textbooks. And so what I think what we want to start doing is getting all the academic associations to say you should at least have some sort of vetting criteria for the people who do submit the textbook, that they should have the credentials to submit. And then other people who are credentialed within that topic should also be part of the evaluation process before it even gets to the public at that point. But right now, I could write a math textbook and they have to consider it, as long as I'm incorporated and all that. No, my book is not for consideration by the State Board of Education. Mine's for the public. And there are textbooks for Mexican American Studies, but a lot of publishers don't want to go through that, because then they'll come out and say, well, we don't like this, and they'll try to, the people who don't want that textbook will try to kill it through 1,000 little comment marks or error marks. And so it's not a good process for developing materials. And that's going to become our position, but not just for Texas, but for the whole country. Yes?
You know, all these books that Bill O'Reilly has written about history,
Mhm.
and Lincoln and Washington
Yeah.
and all that, all this information that he puts in the book, he must have read it somewhere else from different books.
Well, I'm not sure he's writing them. I'm not sure he's writing the books.
Oh, so,
I think he has a ghostwriter and he just puts his name on it.
oh, I see.
Yeah. It's very hard to write a good textbook,
Yeah.
or a good book anyway. I mean,
Because history normally comes from people of older that you hear.
just knowing the amount of time you got to sit down and write a book and do the research. Somebody's producing that and doing the TV show and the radio show and all the stuff that he does. He probably has ghostwriters do it, which is very common, by the way. Yeah.
I recall reading an article years ago about, it had to do with biology textbooks, I think.
Mhm.
And the gist of the article was the author had gone back, taken a text, and it was a college level textbook,
Mhm.
and traced back the ideas and some of the errors in it
Mhm.
to previous textbooks,
Yeah.
going back many, many years.
Yeah.
So I think they actually borrow from,
Oh yeah.
don't do original research,
Well,
they borrow from previous.
And this textbook, the proposed textbook, I mean, definitely less than 50% of textbooks about Mexican American history, so it's less than 50% of the textbooks even about the topic that it should be about, right? It's probably more, we're thinking about less than 30, but we're staying, less than 50, right? So it should automatically reject it for that reason. But the mistakes aren't just mistakes of Mexican American history or omissions, they're mistakes about basic U.S. history and basic Latin American history, because it's very clear and neither of the writers are historians. It's very clear that what they're doing is they're using the internet as their research method for putting together a textbook, as opposed to have taken the time to read the scholarship and do the research that somebody like me would do. And the reality is, a textbook, you should at least have anywhere from 2 to 5 people writing it, because it's such a massive undertaking. Any other questions?
Yeah, a lot of times, well, I read a lot of history books and stuff, and when I read it, they tell you, it happened here in Texas, and this and that. And in my mind, I'm trying to see if I can get somebody to write a history book with some sort of like a map to show the people that it was here, that it happened. I know that a lot of them do have little maps of where
Yeah.
the battle took place here
Yeah.
and there and stuff like that.
Yeah, maps help.
But like showing pictures and a map to show exactly the reader where exactly this happened and what kind of terrain it was and all that kind of
Right.
stuff.
So like for the book I'm working on, the map I have in mind, I haven't put together the map, but the map I have in mind, which is basically going from Laredo to Brownsville, the Nueces Strip, which is the Nueces Strip, right? You have Guerrero Viejo, right, where the Bernard Gutierrez de Lara and his brother came out of, right? You have Cortina, and his thing going on here in Brownsville. You have, before Cortina, you have Carvajal with the Merchants' War, right? Because they're making this argument that exorbitant taxes on trade is problematic for economic success. Before that, in the 1830s, you have the Federalist Centralist fights in Mexico, and the cities along here are making pronouncements of their political positions concerning that conflict, right? So you have the Mexican War of Independence, you have the conflicts within the Federalists and Centralists in the 1830s, 1840s, then you have the U.S.-Mexican War, and then after that you have Carvajal and the Merchant War, then you have Cortina and his war, and then you got the French intervention, and the newspaper starts out the Republican, a Spanish language newspaper called the Republican, because the way they phrase themselves is they're liberal Republicans. The idea of a Republican representative government as opposed to a monarchy, right? That's why they're fighting the French. And then after that, you have Porfirio Diaz starts his revolution from Brownsville. And then after that, you have Caterino Gatza to start a revolution against Porfirio Diaz. And then after that, you have El Primer Congreso Mexicanista in Laredo in 1911, which is the first attempt to create a statewide civil rights organization, They create the Gran Liga Mexicanista, but it doesn't really fall through. And then after 1911, you had the Plan de San Diego in 1915, which is an armed way of trying to get equal rights. And then after that, the next big one's going to be in Harlingen in 1927 with the Harlingen Convention, where they tried to unify all these new political civil rights groups that started in Texas. And then in 29, you have LULAC, and that's where I'm going to end it. But think about all the major political events I've talked about. And it's all happening within the Nueces Strip. Hence, the Nueces Strip, the cradle of Mexican civil rights, is why I'm titling the book that way. Post-LULAC, of course, MAYO meets here. So you have within the Nueces Strip, el primer Congreso Mexicanista, the Harlingen Convention, American GI Forum, and MAYO in '69. Hence why I call it the cradle of Mexican civil rights.
How long is it gonna take you
I gotta start. As my girlfriend says, you need to start saying no to stuff. My plan was to start writing in July, but the textbook popped up, and it was so bad that I thought I was going to get through it rather quickly, and it was just so bad that I bogged down with so many errors, because there were so many errors page by page by page, just on regular U.S. history and stuff like that. That July, August, and of course now, we barely just testified, it's been taken up with that. And it's not just the reading of the text, the writing of the text, it's also the conversations we have as a committee of 8 scholars who are out throughout Texas, talk about what our next moves are, interviews. CNN Espanol contacted me the other day, although I referred them to Emilio because I had to do something on Thursday, right? So I mean, this textbook is international in coverage. England is covering it. Wisconsin had a news story on it. It's in the LA Times, it's in the New York Times, it's in the, I mean, this thing is international in scope as far as the controversy. Hence why the board is feeling a lot of pressure about it. And that's good, because it should not be acceptable in 2016 to make those racist statements. I mean, despite the political climate that Trump has created, it should not be acceptable for you even think that should be in a textbook for children. Not just for Latino kids, but for non-Latino kids. Because we shouldn't be teaching non-Latino kids to be racist towards Latino kids. That is not correct in education.
Well, that's why he's got a commercial, you know, our children are listening. I mean, our children.
Well, I don't have a TV, so I haven't seen all the political commercials.
Yeah, that's what Hillary's got.
She's saying that children, yeah. I heard about it, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, and which is very true. You know, just, I mean, I'm sure we had Trump people here too, but just with his racial comments, you know.
Yeah, no, he's legitimized that sort of conversation. As a presidential candidate, he says it's okay now to talk like this. And that has created an increased hostility within our society. That's not correct. And we're seeing it expressed to the idea that we should be able to teach this to our children.
Racism doesn't want to let go. It
Yeah.
keeps on going.
Yeah. So again, this textbook is not just damaging the Latino kids, it's damaging the non-Latino kids. And I'm an educator. I'm not in the business of teaching kids to hate.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, enough of that. I've done multiple interviews on this already.
Well, thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
So much, we really
We
appreciate
really
it.
enjoyed it.